The clock strikes 12. It is August 15th, 1947. The radio crackles to life. A single voice cuts through the silence of centuries, steady, deep, carrying both pride and pain.
At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. A moment comes.
It was Jawaharlal Nehru, not speaking to a crowd in one hall, but to the heart of a nation, his voice carried by All India Radio. Across the land, India listened. From the Himalayas to the sea in the south, from deserts of Rajasthan to the tea gardens of Assam in the east, in refugee camps, millions held their breath. Astrologers called August 15th inauspicious. So Nehru chose midnight, that single moment when August 14th ended and August 15th began. At dawn, the tricolor was raised over the red fort. The monsoon winds caught its saffron, white and green, as if the land itself breathed again. Across India, bells rang, prayers rose, crowds cheered. For the first time in 2 centuries, the sun rose on a free nation. Cheers erupted, but so did silence, because freedom was won, not as a victory, but as a wound. Partition's shadow bled across the celebration. India was carved into two, not just by departing British hands, but by visions that could not meet. Jinnah, stubborn, unbending, demanded a nation, Pakistan, the only land he claimed where Muslims could be safe. Nehru, a man of words, a man of dreams, imagined one India, united and secular, yet in the end, accepted partition when unity seemed impossible. Gandhi, frail, grieving, walked among riots, pleading for peace, for unity, for a nation that no longer listened. While India's leaders argued, Britain decided. Behind closed doors, the British chose Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a man who had never seen India, yet was told to cut it apart. In 5 weeks, his pen sliced through provinces, fields, families. He left, but the line he drew remained, a scar on the nation's skin. And Mountbatten, the last viceroy, kept those maps locked away, hidden until August 17th, 2 days after independence had been declared. So the blame would not fall on Britain, but on the leaders of the new nations left to face the wound. And so, as the tricolor rose, millions still did not know whether they woke in India or in the new nation of Pakistan. When the borders were finally revealed, the land was torn apart. Millions began their march, on foot, by train, by bullock cart, carrying only what their hands could hold. Some moved toward India, others toward Pakistan, both chasing a home they had never seen, but were told was theirs. Trains rolled across the new border, but many arrived not with passengers, but with the dead, slaughtered along the way. Silent carriages, flags on their roofs, the only sign of where they had come from. On the roads, caravans of refugees were ambushed, families cut down in fields and at river crossings, their cries lost to fire and steel. And for those who survived, there were camps of cloth and mud. Nations had been born, but homes had vanished. By the time the dust settled, nearly 15 million had crossed borders, and more than 1 million lay dead. Independence was won, but carved in blood. And yet, through the bloodshed, the tricolor still flew. India had survived its birth, its first test. India was free, but could it stay whole? The flag was raised, but the map of India was still unfinished. 565 princely states stood apart, each with its own ruler, its own flag, its own army. If left divided, India could break before it even began. At the heart of this storm, one man stepped forward. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Iron in his voice, steel in his resolve, he would sit with princes, not as a conqueror, but as a man who understood a broken nation. You can be a king of a village, he would tell them, or a builder of a nation. Through talks, through pressure, through sheer will, he convinced them. One by one, they signed, and the fragments became a whole, but not all. Some defied. The first crack was Junagadh, a Hindu-majority land ruled by a Muslim Nawab. When freedom came, the Nawab shocked his people. He signed to join Pakistan with Jinnah, a land far away with no border, no link. It was ink on a map, not the will of Junagadh's people. Markets shut. Protest banners filled the streets. Junagadh erupted, and in Delhi, Patel's patience ended. Indian troops marched towards Junagadh. Lines of soldiers marched in, calm, deliberate, unstoppable. The Nawab watched the tricolor's forces advance, and in the dead of night, he fled. Jewels, gold, loyal guards, loaded onto ships bound for Karachi, Pakistan. He left. He carried away treasure, but abandoned his land. And then, the people of Junagadh spoke. In a referendum, they chose India. The Nawab was gone. And over Junagadh, the tricolor rose. But the battle for India's soul was not over. A greater storm was rising in the south. Hyderabad, the largest princely state in India, richer than many nations, ruled by the Nizam, once called the richest man alive. While India was uniting, he dreamed of standing apart, a kingdom surrounded on all sides by India, yet refusing to join. And on his streets, the Razakars, his private militia, spread terror. Villages burned, voices silenced. Patel called it a cancer in the heart of the nation. Talks failed. The time for action had come. In September 1948, India moved. Operation Polo. Columns of Indian troops rolled into Hyderabad. 5 days of fire and thunder. Streets turned into battlefields. Skies shook with artillery. The Nizam's army faltered, step by step. Then the silence came. The Nizam surrendered, and Hyderabad, the jewel of the South, finally belonged to India. But its fall was not without blood. In the days that followed, Hyderabad burned. Hindus and Muslims clashed. Soldiers fought Razakars, and innocents were slaughtered alike. Some say 27,000 died. Others, more than 40,000. For India, it was another wound, carved so soon after partition. Hyderabad burned in 1948. The grief hung heavy. But even as its ashes still blackened the skies, in India's far north, lives were already being cut down. The valley itself was set aflame. October 1947, Kashmir. A land of snow-capped peaks and saffron valleys, a Muslim-majority state ruled by a Hindu king. The Maharaja hesitated, waiting, stalling. He signed with neither India nor Pakistan, and in that hesitation came fire. Thousands of tribal fighters, armed, funded, and sent by Pakistan, stormed into Kashmir. Baramulla, the first town on the road to Srinagar, was set ablaze. Temples, mosques, homes. Nothing was spared. Women and children fled in terror. This was not just war. It was Pakistan's shadow, crossing into Kashmir. In Srinagar, families packed in silence, unsure if they'd live another day, unsure if they'd live in India or in Pakistan. The Maharaja, desperate, sent word to Delhi, and the answer was clear. Sign the instrument of accession. Only then will India defend. On October 26th, the papers were signed, and at dawn, Indian soldiers roared over the mountains. They dropped from the sky, parachutes bursting open like thunderclouds torn apart, raining soldiers into the mud, rifles in hand. What began as defense became the first war of free India. Through the winter of 1947, battles raged in the valleys. Indian soldiers fought to hold Srinagar, to push the invaders back. They held the capital, but the war dragged on. By January 1949, the guns fell silent. Not with victory, but with a ceasefire brokered at the United Nations. India held the valley. Pakistan held what it had seized, a line on the map that still bleeds today. Kashmir was saved, but not solved. And from that first war, the shadow of conflict has never left the valley. India was still unsteady, Partition's wounds still raw, and in Delhi, one frail figure still walked, to his evening prayers pleading for peace. Mahatma Gandhi, frail in body, but unbroken in spirit. He folded his hands, greeting those who came to see him. And then 3 bullets cracked through the silence, tearing into him. The father of the nation fell where he stood. His lips parted with 2 soft words, "Hey Ram." Then, silence. The bullets came from Nathuram Godse, a man who believed Gandhi's vision of unity had betrayed the nation. He thought killing Gandhi would make India endure, harder, stronger, but instead, it broke the nation's heart. The news raced across India like fire. From crowded bazaars to distant villages, the nation wept. An ocean of grief followed his funeral procession. And on the radio, Nehru's voice broke as he said,
"Friends and comrades, the light has gone out of our lives and there is darkness everywhere."
For days, India stood still, a nation draped in grief for its Mahatma. Yet even in that silence of sorrow, the heartbeat of freedom did not stop. Yet even in that darkness, India did not stop. In Delhi's halls, the Constituent Assembly worked day and night, drafting the law of free people. For the first time, India was not ruled by kings or by colonizers. It was India, writing its own destiny. At its heart was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the architect of that constitution. He carved into its pages the rights of every citizen: equality, liberty, justice. No throne, no crown, only the people. For the farmer, it meant dignity. For the worker, protection. For the child, a future. And for every Indian, a voice that could no longer be silenced. And on January 26, 1950, that promise came alive. The tricolor rose above the Red Fort, not as a flag of protest, but of power. Crowds lined the streets of Delhi. The first Republic Day parade marched past India Gate, elephants, soldiers, school children, all carrying the same colors. For the first time, the world saw a nation not of princes or emperors, but of its people. India had been reborn, not by the hand of kings, but by the will of millions. But a republic in words alone was only a promise, waiting to be tested. To live, it needed the people's voice. And so, in 1951, India prepared for its greatest test, the first general election. Around the world, few believed it could happen. They said democracy could not survive here, that India was too poor, too divided, too broken. The world conspired in doubt, waiting for failure. Ballot boxes traveled by bullock cart, by boat, by foot, even strapped to the backs of elephants, to the farthest corners of the land. For the first time, every Indian, rich or poor, man or woman, held the same power: a single vote. When the results came, Jawaharlal Nehru stood before the nation, chosen not by kingship, but by the people. The world watched in disbelief. Democracy had found its home in India. The 1950s became the age of building. From the Bhakra Nangal Dam to the steel plants of Bhilai and Rourkela, a young nation turned rivers and furnaces into its new temples. Classrooms and laboratories came alive. The IITs, the institutions of learning and science, opened their doors to a new generation. Abroad, India refused to be a pawn in the Cold War. It chose its own road, non-alignment, standing with neither East nor West, but with the newly free nations of the world. The 1950s had begun with partition scars, but it ended with a republic alive, breathing, and building. Yet, even as the nation rose, new challenges waited in the icy mountains of the Himalayas and on its borders near the sea. Goa. For 4 centuries, it had remained under Portugal's rule. While India won freedom in 1947, Goa remained chained to a European past. Talks dragged on for 14 years, promises failed. Would Goa remain a colony forever? In December 1961, India moved. Indian soldiers stepped onto Goan soil, not as strangers, but as homecoming. Above them, jets roared low. Shaking the old Portuguese forts, the Portuguese resisted. Shots rang out. But their defenses crumbled in barely 36 hours. The guns fell silent. And then, a moment the land had waited 4 centuries to see. The Portuguese flag lowered, the tricolor rising in its place. Church bells rang in Panjim. Crowds cheered through the narrow streets. Goa was free. The last colony was gone. And at last, India was whole. But celebration was brief. Beyond the Himalayas, a new threat was taking shape. 1962. From the mountains, the guns thundered. China attacked. China had never accepted India's borders. In the north, it seized Aksai Chin, carving a road across Indian land. In the east, it laid claim to Arunachal, calling it its own. And when the Dalai Lama fled the Chinese crackdown in Tibet, India gave him refuge in Dharamshala, a decision that China never forgave. Still, Nehru trusted in friendship. He spoke of Hindi Chini bye-bye, but in October 1962, that trust was shattered. Chinese troops poured across the Himalayas. Wave after wave, they descended into the valleys. Indian Jawans, poorly clothed, poorly armed, stood in the snow with rifles from another war. They fought till their last bullets, then with knives, and then, with bare hands, outposts were overrun. At Namkachu, entire companies were wiped out. At Tawang, young soldiers froze where they fell. Some died with the tricolor still clutched in their hands. Their last cry echoed through the frozen silence. Nehru's voice broke on the radio. My heart goes out to the people of Assam. But across India, every heart sank with him. By November, India's pride was shaken. 3,000 soldiers were gone. A young nation, barely 15 years free, had suffered its first great defeat. But from that heartbreak came resolve. India rebuilt its defenses, its industry, its army, and the next time, India would be ready. Was this the end of a dream, or the beginning of a resolve? India stitched itself back together, brick by brick, field by field, even as India carried the weight of the defeat. Factories roared, fields stirred, classrooms filled, but Jawaharlal Nehru, the voice of midnight, grew tired under the weight of loss. On May 27, 1964, his heart fell silent, and he passed away. A nation stood still. For a moment, it felt as if even time had paused. And into that silence stepped a humble, soft-spoken man, Lal Bahadur Shastri. No thunder, no drama, just 4 clear words to bind a wounded country. Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. Honor the soldier, honor the farmer, hold the border, feed the nation. And then came 1965. Small clashes grew into a war. Across the border with Pakistan, that summer exploded into war. It began in the shadows, Pakistan's Operation Gibraltar. Thousands of Pakistani men slipped into Kashmir, disguised as locals, to spark an uprising. But the people of Kashmir turned them away. They revealed the infiltrators. The plan collapsed. Kashmir stood with India. And then, fire. Pakistani tanks rolled across Punjab's fields. At Asal Uttar, Indian soldiers dug into the mud, waiting. When Pakistan's modern Patton tanks thundered forward, the fields turned into a trap. By dawn, 90 tanks burned. The earth itself became a graveyard of Pattons. In Kashmir, Indian Jawans climbed vertical cliffs in rain and darkness. At Haji Pir Pass, they fought hand to hand, seizing the very route the infiltrators had used. A victory written in blood and snow. In the skies, the world watched in disbelief. India's tiny Nats fighter jets, nicknamed the Sabre Slayers, shot down Pakistan's American F-86 Sabres. Against all odds, the air belonged to India. And yet, this was not just the army's war. Farmers in Punjab gave their tractors, their bullocks, their carts, hauling tanks to the front. Shastri's words echoed everywhere. Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, honor the soldier, honor the farmer. Indian forces reached deep into Pakistan, so close that Lahore's lights could be seen. But the war froze at the border. The UN mediated a ceasefire. The soldiers stopped. India had not bent. India had not broken. From the fields of Punjab to the passes of Kashmir to the skies above, India had triumphed. But triumph turned to tragedy in Tashkent, Russia. January 1966. After signing peace with Pakistan in Tashkent, Lal Bahadur Shastri, the man who gave India victory and a voice, went to bed. By morning, he was gone. Officially, a heart attack. But questions lingered. Why no post-mortem? Why the blue marks on his body? Why the secrecy? A nation that had just celebrated victory was stunned. India's prime minister, the voice that had said Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, was silenced. In a foreign land, under a cloud of mystery. The war had ended in pride, but Shastri's death left behind a question India still carries. 1966. India was still in shock. Nehru was gone. Shastri, silenced in Tashkent. A young nation stood leaderless, searching for its voice. And into that silence walked Indira Gandhi, Nehru's daughter, Shastri's reluctant heir. The press mocked her. Rivals whispered she was weak. They called her a gungi gudiya, a dumb doll. When Indira Gandhi took charge in 1966, the nation doubted her. Some saw her as inexperienced. Some dismissed her as a figurehead. But history would soon test her and prove them wrong. 1966. India's fields cracked with drought. Harvest died. Ships from America arrived, their wheat stacked like lifeboats. But every sack carried a condition. And for India, it felt like chains. For a proud nation, it was humiliation. But it also lit a fire. Indira Gandhi vowed India would never beg for grain again. And from the fields of Punjab, a golden tide of wheat began. New seeds, new harvests. The Green Revolution was born, but her battles did not end in the soil. They moved into the streets and the halls of power. In 1967, state after state slipped from Congress' hands. Whispers said she was weak, a stopgap, nothing more. Yet Indira struck back, bold, relentless. In 1969, she nationalized 14 banks. The poor cheered, the rich raged, because now credit and loans would flow to every Indian, not just the rich. The old guard of Congress turned against her. The Congress party was split in two. Some called it courage, others raw hunger for power. By the end of the decade, India had a new leader, admired, feared, controversial. Indira Gandhi, no longer in Nehru's shadow, but casting one of her own. By 1971, the test arrived. In East Pakistan, today's Bangladesh, millions cried for freedom. They voted for Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. But in West Pakistan, his victory was denied. The army from West Pakistan cracked down in East Pakistan. Villages burned, women violated, rivers filled with bodies. In Dhaka University, professors were lined up, students shot in their dormitories, a nation's voice, silenced in a single night. Pakistan called it Operation Searchlight. 10 million refugees flooded into India. Border towns overflowed with tents, hunger, and grief. The nation was stretched to its limits. Indira Gandhi carried their voices to the world. She traveled from Washington to London, pleading, "This is not politics, this is humanity." But the world powers stayed silent. India could not. Indira Gandhi stood before the nation and before the world, declaring, "We cannot close our eyes to genocide on our borders." December 1971, India moved. Jets screamed over the skies of Dhaka. On land, Indian tanks rolled through East Pakistan. In the Bay of Bengal, the Navy carrier INS Vikrant unleashed her planes, cutting off East Pakistan from the sea. For 13 days, fire thundered across the subcontinent. And then, just as victory neared, the ocean itself turned against India. The United States, Pakistan's ally, sent the 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal, a nuclear-armed carrier group, steaming toward Indian waters. The message was clear: stop or face America. But India was not alone. From the Pacific, Soviet warships moved in, shadowing the US fleet, superpower against superpower, while Indian Army marched towards Dhaka. For the first time, the Cold War came to India's shores. Two superpowers stared across the seas until December 16, 1971. Dhaka, General A.A.K. Niazi of Pakistan, signed the Instrument of Surrender before India's General J.S. Arora. Never since World War II had so many soldiers laid down arms. 93,000 surrendered in Dhaka. The world had never seen defeat written so large. For 24 years after independence, East Pakistan was denied its language, its rights, its voice. When India defended its people, the demand for freedom could no longer be silenced. And from the ruins of war, a new nation rose. Bangladesh. India had fought and won, not just against Pakistan, but against the weight of the world. But triumph came with a price. War drains more than blood. It drains bread, fuel, and coin. By 1973, oil prices exploded, 4 times higher overnight. The shock slammed into India. Petrol pumps stood empty. Queues stretched for hours. Food prices spiraled, and families had to skip meals. Dhaka had given India pride. But in the streets and villages, another battle began, against prices, shortages, and hunger. On the streets, anger boiled. Students marched. Workers struck. From Gujarat to Bihar, voices rose, asking if freedom had kept its word. And into that fire stepped Jaya Prakash Narayan, JP, a freedom fighter once, now a rebel again. He called for a total revolution. Crowds swelled behind him, not just demanding food, not just jobs, but the fall of the Prime Minister. Delhi trembled. By 1975, Indira Gandhi was under siege. The streets burned with protests. The economy staggered under inflation, and then came a hammer blow. The Allahabad High Court ruled her guilty of electoral fraud in the 1971 election. Her seat was invalidated, her post as Prime Minister stripped away, and JP stood before the crowds, his voice sharp as steel. "I call upon the police, the army. Remember your oath. Obey the Constitution, not one person, not the Prime Minister." For Indira Gandhi, it was not just protest anymore. It was rebellion at her gates. And then, June 25, 1975, the radio crackled again. But this was no Nehru at midnight, no promise of freedom. It was Indira Gandhi's voice. One word, cut through the air: emergency. The president signed the order in the dead of night, without a question. That single word, rewrote the nation. The Constitution was suspended. The Prime Minister's word became law. For the first time, the rights promised to every Indian, speech, press, protest, even the vote, were locked away. That night, India changed. Phones went dead. Printing presses stopped. Opposition leaders were dragged from their beds in darkness. Over a lakh were jailed. A democracy turned into a prison. In the morning, newspapers left their front pages empty, a silent, black and white monument to the truth that was no longer there. On the streets, there were no slogans, no marches, because protest was prison, dissent was fear. Curfews spread. In the name of population control, men were dragged to clinics, forced into sterilization, never to father again. Villages, scarred forever, ordinary lives, were ruled not by law, but by order. And yet, the trains still ran, schools still opened, offices still worked. On the surface, life went on, but under every roof, a whisper grew. That the land which had shouted for freedom in 1947 was now afraid of its own voice. In one small town, a father leaned close to his son and whispered, "Don't speak outside, only walls can hear us now." For 21 long months, 635 days, that was India, a nation alive, yet silenced. Its heartbeat slowed, its voice stolen, but inside those days, no one knew how long it would last. Not weeks, not months, perhaps forever. And in that darkness, a question grew. Had the lady who won Bangladesh lost India's soul? For 21 months, the nation obeyed in silence, but silence cannot last forever. Families mourned their sons, dead in sterilization camps. Students whispered in anger. Farmers groaned under shortages, and slowly, doubt spread, not just outside, but inside her own Congress party. Advisors urged elections to prove her strength. Indira Gandhi agreed. She believed the people would still stand with her. March 1977. India went to the polls. For the first time in free India's history, it was not just a vote, it was a verdict. When the boxes opened, the truth thundered. The Congress was crushed. Indira Gandhi herself lost her seat. The lady who declared emergency was now without a voice. And at the Red Fort, a new prime minister from the Janata Party took the oath. Morarji Desai, 81 years old, a freedom fighter, stood tall, leading the first non-Congress government in India's history. The emergency ended. India breathed free again. From the midnight of freedom to the silence of emergency, India had walked through fire, scarred, tested, unbroken. But this was not the end. Beyond 1977, the battle for India's soul was only beginning. New storms, new voices, new battles, and the question that would define a generation: what would India become before the century's end?